This is the Convergent Science Network podcast. Leading researchers in the domain of neuroscience, brain theory, and technology are interviewed by Paul Verschure and Tony Prescott.
This is Paul Verschure with the Convergent Science Network podcast. And I'm having a conversation with Moshe Bar, who's a speaker at our summer school in Barcelona. And Moshe, you started your presentation with a view on perception where you brought in, let's say, a key role for, let's say, prediction and top-down components.
Yes.
So what's the key observation and the key insight there?
Well, you mean what brought me to this conclusion, to this presentation? Yeah. So first of all, it's not only mine, so I can't claim complete pioneering movement here. But the idea here is that we've known for decades that most connections, if not all, in the brain are reciprocal. They go in both directions, and still the idea of feedback hasn't been incorporated into mainstream thinking about the brain sufficiently. So you see it here and there, but when you just open any textbook on perception and cognition, you see some kind of an artificial boundary between perception and cognition. There's first perception that you can think of as the analysis of physical signals coming through to the brain through the senses. And once we understand what is it that we perceive, cognition kicks in. That's the old traditional view. Cognition kicks in as in memory, attention allocation, executive decisions, and so forth. But there's actually no real reason why there will be a boundary between cognition and perception. And our and others' idea is that actually cognition and perception are intertwined and they help each other whenever possible. And therefore, the bottom line is that what we see and what we perceive from our environment is to a large extent affected but by cognition and by memory and by what we expect and what are our goals. So perception is not purely affected by the senses, but rather also with top-down information.
But now, would you be able to give a number to that? Would you say, look, under normal...
50-50.
50-50?
Yeah.
It doesn't vary with task
Well, it does
demands.
vary. It does vary. No, of course.
So what's the range in which it can vary?
I think 0 to 100.
Okay. Okay.
So we spoke, if you remember, towards the end of the talk, people ask about meditation, and I think people that do meditation are actually 100% bottom up. Mm-hmm. I think they quiet down completely the top down effects, and there are interesting findings that I think Similak or Eastwood, that's the name of the authors of these interesting studies that we called in the lab the Zen studies. Mm-hmm. They're not ours, but we just really love these findings. And in these specific search tasks, I believe, they ask people to just lean back, relax, and let the display come to them. And people improve their performance just by the fact that they're kind of quieting down their top-down expectations. So you look for T's among L's, and you perform better when you just lean back and relax and don't think about anything. So there are some cases where expectations actually might be bad for you, especially when you have no basis for your expectations. They're completely like me in the stock market, right? If I lose my expertise there, I'll lose my house. So whenever you don't have any expertise, or whenever there is a situation that's completely novel or completely not based on the past, then it's better to quiet off the expectations. And this is a case where I would imagine it's 100% bottom up and 0% top down. Let's think about a case where it's only predictions. Well, I guess, or only top down. I think it's when you plan, right? When you plan, you're kind of only planning. You don't have the input. You just sit down now and plan your dinner. You don't have any input other than from within. So I guess, so I think it's roughly between 0 to 100%.
Right. But now, so here we have the proactive brain, okay? And now the proactive brain would, in some form, go from sensor states to predictions. But now you used different kinds of techniques, like and human subjects, like fMRI and EEG and so on, to try to sort of disentangle these pathways a little bit. And a surprising result that you presented was that in some sense, if we look at these, if you want, prediction pathways, that in some sense we jump outside sort of the traditional areas of visual processing. So it doesn't seem to be restricted to just, let's say, the ventral stream and the temporal lobe, but also to involve frontal areas. So it seems rather surprising to now include more frontal areas in perception. So how should I think about that?
So these findings don't necessarily mean that the prefrontal cortex is suddenly involved in perception per se, but it just supports what I said at the beginning of our conversation, that perception and cognition are not separated. And the role of prefrontal cortex in helping perception be accomplished is an example of cognition helping perception. So something about these high-level areas in the prefrontal cortex and maybe anterior temporal cortex and other regions send down initial guesses to help the perception of the signal to be accomplished in a quicker and more in a quicker and more efficient manner. So the involvement of the OFC, specifically orbital frontal cortex, as we discussed yesterday, seems to be polysensory. So it's not that OFC is a visual area all of a sudden, but it's an area that helps predicting. And it helps predicting, even though we didn't test it, but I believe that it predicts also in other modalities such as olfaction. And it also predicts in higher level events, not only detecting objects, but also preparing for a new situation or a new script that's coming up. So, and OFC, as we know, is also connected with the limbic system, and people think about affect and about reward in the context of OFC. And we think that the reason people see activation in this prefrontal region, specifically in the OFC, in tasks that involve reward and affect, as well as in our own experiments on predictions, is because what unites all these different processes, even though they seem separated, there's a common element to all of them, which is a predictive element. So when you're estimating a reward or an affective value, you think about the future. You think about what would it give me, or how would it punish me, or what would we do for me or for anybody? What would be the outcome of a certain choice? So I think the OFC should more wholly be seen as a primary player in thinking about the future and predictions, rather in being specific to vision or to affect or to reward.
Okay, but then, so that means OFC, which is sort of integrating information from many sources, including vision, is making predictions at, let's say, a behavioral timescale. So there would be seconds, not milliseconds, or both.
Both. I mean, in our experiments, it was tens of milliseconds. So, right. Yeah. So, I don't know about the longer range, but I'm pretty sure that OFC is recruited also when people do what's called affective forecasting, when people try to predict what would a trip to the Bahamas do to you if you're going in half a year from now. So it's far away, but still you can estimate, even though people show that affective forecasting is something that we're not so good at. And but nevertheless, I think that OFC is responsive or is involved in all time scales of predictions, not necessarily.
Is there any upper bound to that, or that would also go to hours and days?
As I said, with the VK, I didn't do any experiments, so I'm just speculating.
I understand.
Yeah, but I don't see any reason why it would go elsewhere, this type of process, to depending on time scale, it will go to another area. I think if there's a region that knows how to do this, it can be employed in all time scales. I don't see why not, but okay. I can't say more than speculate. Yeah,
but there's another element or piece of the puzzle that you also revealed, which is that it's not that the OFC in some sense gets a very, let's say, rough impression of the world, right? It's not that it gets a high resolution kind of impression, but it's a fairly rough understanding of the world. So what's going on there?
So in the case of our experiments, which was in vision, what you're referring to was a low spatial frequency, or you can think of as a blurred picture of reality, meaning that we indeed, as you said, OFC is not sensitive to the details. It's not informed of the details. It just gets the gist. It gets the gist of a picture, of a scene, of a situation, and it's enough to direct the more specified expert type of cortex, in this case the visual cortex, how to behave, what to focus the analysis on. So it's enough to say, hey, there is a blob in the upper right corner, which is not expected. I guess you should go there and analyze it thoroughly because it might be something falling on my head or something like this. So you're right completely that what we're saying is that it has a gist level understanding. But as I showed, I really like this picture of a street with a car in the middle, and all of you guys knew that it was a car, even though the picture is severely blurred. So our ability to understand these blobs keeps surprising me, and I came to the conclusion where give me a context and a low spatial frequency image, and I know what everything in the picture is. Of course, if you want to know a type of a car or identity of a person or something like this, you'll need the details. I'm not saying that the details are useless, but for everyday quick decisions, low spatial frequency seems sufficient in many instances.
So your prediction would be that this would also hold for other modalities. Like if we look at audition, for instance,
right?
It would also be, let's say, some low-pass filtered version of an auditory world that would enter OFC.
Yeah, this would be my prediction, but I would love seeing it done by somebody. But
of course, yeah. But then, why would it rely on this low-pass filtered version of the world?
Why would it?
Yeah, because it seems. Look, maybe you gain a few dozen milliseconds because you can rely on sort of a bit faster pathways to get the information. So here we go, OFC. We gain 10 milliseconds as compared to a fast processing or a high resolution processing pathway. So why would those 10 milliseconds be so critical?
Yes. So I used to think like this too, and it puzzled me. Why would, it's not 10 milliseconds, a few tens of milliseconds, but still.
Exaggerating, but still. Yeah.
I just recognizing a chair. Why would I need any why would I need any advanced warning? So there are two things here. First, it's the most trivial answer, which is this ability has evolved mostly for survival-related, more crucial type of recognition, like Ledoux's example, John Ledoux example with a snake in the woods, that you want to know if it's a snake, or you don't care if it's a snake or a hose or it's just a type of a branch. You just want to run away because in some very coarse level, it already looks suspicious, so we're safer if you just run away from it and analyze the high spatial frequencies later on. So in that case, getting half a second head start over the snake might be beneficial. But I think there's something unfair about thinking, oh, you know what, the HSF will bring all the information anyway. Why do I need to rush? The thing is that I don't think that there's much that can be done on an image with high spatial frequencies only. I have some pictures that I didn't show yesterday, but kind of high spatial frequency only images that you can make sense out of them. You can look at them for hours, but you can't make sense out of them. So you need the low spatial frequencies, but actually it goes back to your question of why do you need them earlier? So I guess I'll stick to the first answer, which is, yeah.
But that seems very funny, right? Because, okay, the results are there, so we don't have to debate the data.
Right.
But if you think about the brain as some sort of layered structure, where indeed you have structures like the amygdala that Joe Ledoux has been working quite a bit on, and there the interpretation, the amygdala is actually really a fast, let's say, an alarm detector that rapidly prepares you for action to defend yourself against threats in the world. And now it seems OFC in this interpretation is like rather redundant compared to such a really fast responder like the amygdala.
So I think they share the information. As we know, they are connected heavily, and I think they both share, I suspect they both share the same information, including low spatial frequencies. We've shown in other studies where it was initially an unrated study, but somehow it became linked to it. It was a study about first impressions, how people judge other people's faces. And we show the faces. We want to see how fast, how first are first impressions. And we show them faster and faster and faster. And we found that people, even in the masked presentations of faces, in 39 milliseconds, were already able to recognize and categorize them as threatening versus non-threatening. Well, we didn't know what's the actual personality of these people. So this was just correlated with much longer presentations of a few seconds. So 39 milliseconds were enough for people to be accurate in their first impressions, to the extent that first impressions are accurate. And then the follow-up experiment was to filter those faces, because our assumption or our hypothesis was that this extraction of features from faces to infer certain, threatness or whether it's threatening or not, was based on low spatial frequencies, of course.
Yeah.
So that's how we filter, and that's exactly what we found. That people judge faces quickly, and they use low spatial frequencies for this judgment and not the high spatial frequencies.
Right.
So it's not only the speed, but also the content that makes them. And we found that this activation was in the amygdala. So it was that, and I think others, I'm pretty sure actually that others have shown sensitivity to low spatial frequencies in the amygdala. So here we're talking about an OFC that's in a way an extension of the amygdala. You can say it's redundant, but you can also think about its anatomical connections and how it's a polysensory hub that gets information and sends information to so many modalities at the same time. So I think it's important that if the amygdala has this a priori information that can help make quick decisions, share this information with this area that can. Okay,
but this is interesting, right? Because originally, when you look at the story superficially, so from the outside, it looks like it's a story focusing on visual perception. So you think, okay, we have sort of a visual hierarchy, and that sort of sends information to the orbital frontal cortex, and orbital frontal cortex might be then generating predictions back to this sort of visual hierarchy to help it sort of resolve all sort of recognition problems. But if you analyze it in these terms, it sounds much more like, let's say, a parallel processing stream that is capitalizing on subcortical processing, like by the amygdala. So which of these two views would you lean to? Would you say both, or it's indeed orbital frontal is more driven by the subcortical pathways, or is it capitalizing other input streams?
Well, I think, and I'm sure that you'd share this view, that the brain is pretty opportunistic in the sense that it will use any information it could to solve a certain problem. So I'm not ready to commit to only subcortical or only cortical. I think it uses everything possible. We know from the anatomy that it gets more of this subcortical information. So I'm happy to say that OFC or to hypothesize that OFC indeed benefits from subcortical pathways, but at the same time, we know that dorsal pathways that have this magnocellular type of information project to OFC, and I don't see why OFC has to commit only to subcortical or only. And in a way, now you're bringing me to think aloud about another advantage of OFC over amygdala. Not advantage in a sense. I mean, we're not comparing them, but information that OFC has that amygdala doesn't, which is more this cortical information that it's getting from the dorsal and from other pathways. So it can integrate information from more sources than just the amygdala.
Well, in some sense, OFC will be well placed to modulate the amygdala in its responses to these stimuli, because the amygdala needs this kind of control.
Exactly.
Right? Or we're jumping all the time. Right? Seeing snakes everywhere. But that might mean that this interpretation of you exploiting information in the OFC to resolve the perception problem might actually not really be the right emphasis, right? So maybe OFC is just exploiting this low frequency information, accumulating, if you want, predictions, building up context information about the world for more general, let's say, action planning, something along these lines.
Some people talk about this, and there's a chapter or a paper that I wrote with Lisa Feldman-Barrett that talks exactly about how these predictions actually prepare the body. It's more in the context of affect, but I won't be surprised if these predictions that are generated or triggered by the OFC are then disseminated not only to perception, but just, anybody, any taker, any area that wants to benefit or can benefit from it will get it, including, of course, preparation for action.
But now, okay, so now we have OFC. OFC has been building up predictions, right? And predictions, as you said earlier, at multiple timescales. So, and then the example could be, let's say, the blurry car in the blurry street. So now I can say, okay, car in the street, and I have the following predictions about the building collapsing and Superman coming out of the phone booth and so on, right? But now, if you think about context or contextual memory, you very quickly end up with structures like the hippocampus. So first we looked at now the comparison with amygdala, But in some sense, you could then also argue if OFC gives me contextual information, in some sense, I seem to be repeating a bit the job of my hippocampus, which we know is very much dedicated to the formation of these episodic memories. So look, I am in this street and I see the car and the building collapsed and so on. So what's the added value now of OFC if I compare it to this notion of episodic memory?
At some point, you stopped representing what I'm saying and you start saying something else. And I didn't really claim that OFC does context. It doesn't activate context.
Okay.
It triggers predictions. I'm not even sure that the predictions themselves are the OFC, or rather it sends instructions to the relevant cortex, what kind of predictions or what kind of representations are relevant, and just bring them online and make it a prediction by bringing them online. So in the studies I showed in the second half of my talk, where I talked about context, it wasn't the OFC anymore that was involved. It was another prefrontal region, the medial prefrontal cortex, that was part of a network that included the medial temporal lobe, especially the parahippocampal cortex, and the retrosplenial area with the posterior cingulate. So there it plays, it's different than the role of the OFC, and we're still studying actually up to late last night. I was corresponding with two people in my lab about a review that we're writing, and we try to figure out what does the prefrontal cortex does in this what does it do in this type of a network of context. And there are different hypotheses. It's still speculative, but I can, so I'm not sure you want to hear them, but we think there are different types of contextual activations in the medial temporal lobe and in the retrosplenial, which some will be more sensitive to the specifics of the context. So when I tell you kitchen, context of a kitchen, you can think about 5-7 items, but you're not committing to a specific appearance. The fridge can be stainless steel, or it can be white. It could be on the left, it could be on the right. Some basic stuff like that a sink is concave and it will be on the level of the counter. But other specific features you're not committing to because you need to see the actual exemplar, the specific kitchen. And then these blobs, these slots are being filled with actual specifics. So there is a coarse or abstract representation of a context. People in the cognitive psychology in the past called it schema, for example. So there is a schema or a frame of a specific context, and it's yet to be filled. There is a kitchen, an oven, and a sink, and a refrigerator there, but you don't know where and you don't know how exactly they look. So you give some basic information. So one part of this network is sensitive to the schema, and we think it's the retrosplenial cortex. And together with Elissa Eminoff and Dan Schachter, we published some studies that support this. But the specific appearance and the specific properties of the context frame is filled up with details, and this happens more in the parahippocampal cortex and possibly also in the hippocampus. So this is more sensitive to the end and with interactions with the visual cortex in the sense of a visual context. What the medial prefrontal cortex does here is, again, we think some sort of an integration, but we're far from being able to make it explicit.
Okay, but the concept would be something like a frontal area gives you more, let's say, a frame for integration, a more an abstract kind of representational scheme, which indeed you might fill in also partially with predictions coming from your orbital frontal cortex, what have you. But now to fill in those hooks with concrete information, you have to rely on areas like parahippocampal area or even hippocampus itself, or then a visual hierarchy in case it's vision. This is a bit the concept.
Yeah.
Right? So frontal more, let's say, an abstract framework, there's a frame in which you would integrate, and sort of preceding areas really providing you with that content.
What I was saying that the retrosplenial, actually, the medial parietal is the one that involves the more abstract representation, the more abstract of a context frame, and the prefrontal cortex does some kind of integration. And we shouldn't forget also the time dimension, the temporal domain, where actually things in context don't necessarily happen simultaneously.
Right, I wanted to ask you about that, because you presented some interesting results on that, which had to do with how these different areas actually establish specific phase relationships in their responses.
Right.
So how is that informative about their interactions?
That's very good. Just before I get into this, I don't want the previous point to be lost. What I was talking about there was that context can be a spatial context of things that happen at the same time together in the same environment. But there's also a temporal dimension of things happening after things or before things. So there is some kind of temporal order so a context is that if you hear a certain sound, you expect another sound afterwards, right? So context can be in space, it could be in time. And back to your question, this phase lock analysis that we're doing especially with MEG, it's much easier to do it because the signal has such better temporal resolution. It allows us to infer, we can't really conclude, but suggest and infer patterns of connectivities. That this can also be done with DCM and other methods, also with MRI. But with MEG, we could look for areas that are co-activated with the same phase or with a fixed phase difference. And from this, we suspect that these areas do something together. They're active at the same time in the same pattern. And we took it a step further, and I think it relates to a question you asked yesterday, and we wanted to test causality. So if area A and area B are activated in the same pattern, does it mean that one affects the other or the other way around, or there's a third factor here, or they're just synchronized as an epiphenomenon? So using tools such as Granger causality, we could test which area affects the other. So I really like these demonstrations, even though again nothing here is completely conclusive, because this is highly suggestive that certain areas speak and affect other areas. And it's interesting that in MEG experiment of this context network that I mentioned, I didn't present these results yesterday, but we find that objects that are highly contextual, like the roulette that I showed yesterday, or a bowling pin, that are highly diagnostic of a specific context, this network of three main nodes is active and also is highly correlated, highly phase locked. These three nodes are highly phase locked. If you show an object like scissors or a cherry that is not highly contextual, it's as common in our environment, even more common than a roulette. But it's as common and as we equated in all dimensions that we can think of. This network might be somewhat activated because all of us have some associations with everything else, but it's not as diagnostic and as consistent. As a result, these nodes are not as synchronized. So supporting our suggestion that this network is related to contextual associations.
But so it's essentially a 3-node system, right?
Yeah.
What would each node provide a specific component of that context information in this case, following that framework we discussed earlier?
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
no, go ahead.
Yeah. So that's the framework. That's the network that I was trying to ascribe functions to each node, where we're talking about a schema or an abstract context frame with slots that are yet to be filled, right. And then another node that involves that provides the actual features, the actual properties, and the third node, maybe the prefrontal cortex, that does the integration of some sort and maybe utilizes this information to deploy other areas with predictions.
But now the synchronization across these 3 nodes is, let's say, a straightforward form of synchronization. Let's say they all start to oscillate in sync and that's it. Or do you see a more, let's say, fine-tuning? Or let's say you will only see a synchronization within a certain frequency range and not in others. And that this is, again, node-specific.
Well, I wish we could be so elaborate in our in this first analysis, but I definitely can tell you that the asynchrony was in specific frequency bands, which I can't recall now, but it's a PNAS paper that came out a year or two ago. So it was specific to a frequency band. It didn't just happen all over. But I wish I could tell, and maybe in the future we will be able to say how this synchronization is modulated with different information. There are some intriguing demonstrations that started, like many other good things, started with old cognitive psychology. So, for example, if I give you the word bank, you can activate 2 types of context frames as we call them context frame. One of them is a bank with money and with tellers and all these things. The other one is the river bank, right? When you think about fishing, jumping into the water, vacation. So for a given second or moment, there are 2 context frames that are active. And then if I tell you bank, water, then it kind of disambiguates it, and you know it's the bank with the river, not the other bank. So you suppress one context frame, you activate the other, and you're more committed to it now. So I bet if you could look at, and we did something like this with vision, also with objects, and I bet if you looked at the synchrony of this network, within this network during this process, you would see some adjustments being made as two context frames are activated. One of them is suppressed, the other one is committed to. So I would expect this synchrony, if it's related to the actual function, to be changed based on this process.
Right. But now, there are two interpretations of this, right? Because you could say, well, what you call the context frame could be like an immersion property, if you want, of this synchronized activity across your three nodes. Or you could localize it within one of the nodes and say, and the other guys are sort of piping information into it. So is it possible to distinguish between these two interpretations?
Not at this point. I think that they're equally likely, yeah.
Do you have a preference for any of these two interpretations? Or
I like my interpretation with black coffee and no, I don't have any personal preference. No, I think that they're given what we know about prefrontal cortex, if I had to put money on something, I would put money on the interpretation that says that everything feeds into the prefrontal cortex and then it decides what to do and guides other areas. But the data don't show it yet, so I can't commit to it.
Right. Okay. So now you also, after dealing with this issue of a context network that we now discussed, right? So what are the ingredients of context in that? Are there boundaries to context information that you would consider in this network? For instance, you could say, well, context does not include information about self because context is only oriented towards the outside world. This could be a boundary.
Yeah, that's interesting because for a while we had a little debate with a group of people that ascribe specifically to the parahippocampal cortex role in place. And initially the criticism was, hey, what you found as contextual activation in parahippocampal is actually place, is spatial information. So for this, which was legitimate criticism, for this we had to design experiments that differentiated between spatial context and context that's more abstract, like a picture of Cupid and a heart-shaped chocolate box, right? So both of them has to do with romance, and you hardly see them both together. I never saw Cupid in my life, so you never see them together in the same place. So or justice or other contexts that are not as physically bound to each other and not necessarily spatially related to each other. So we proved our point that context, and especially in this network, is not limited to space-related context. But it did make us think about, okay, so what is context if it's not appearing together? Because it's so tempting and so easy to think about context as space, as things that happen together. And I started to think pretty intensely about, okay, what defines context if it's not space? And another construction definition that I'm currently liking the best is that actually contextual relation is or contextually related are all the items that are activated together. So rather than looking at the environment, it's looking at the brain. All the things that are activated together as a result of one of them appearing or occurring are contextually related. So if I show you a picture of Cupid, you activate other things that are related to it in your mind. And these are the things that's the definition of context in my mind. Now, self can and cannot be, depending on the instance, because if you want to think about the context of a cold shower right now, you would imagine yourself in the shower, I guess, and you can. I
was more thinking about you in the cold shower me at the beach.
Okay, so me in the cold shower. Okay, so then it's not self. It's yes, but I think that self is just, in that regard, might be another item that could be in and out.
But if you define it so broadly, then contexts start to coincide with something like working memory, I guess, because you're saying anything that is active in the brain.
Well, as a result of relation, not as a result of, if I give you a telephone number and you put it in your working memory, that's not because the digits are contextually related. But just to finish the point about the self, if you don't mind,
Sure.
We have to be aware also of other people's findings here that this network it's a medial network that we call the contextual network with the 3 nodes, the prefrontal, the medial temporal, and the medial parietal, as I showed yesterday, also highly overlaps with the default network.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And in the default network, so we treat them almost as the same. And the default network has received a lot of attention recently of people trying to explain its function, trying to find a function. And one of the prominent theories, other than our own account of saying, the default network is engaged in associative activation and the generation of predictions, as in planning and simulations. But there are some groups think that the default network does self-referential processes, things that relate to self. So in a way, they'll answer your question. Sure, context is self because it's the same network. It's activated both by context and by self.
But now if we, so if we now slowly move then to this possible similarity with the default network, so is the default network for you an epiphenomenon, or it's sort of a real feature of brain dynamics that we should explain?
Oh, it's definitely a real feature, and it's intended. I mean, you can't have third of the brain active so vigorously, wasting so much energy as an epiphenomenon or something that's useless. I'm sure that in my logic, at least, or in my thinking, it has to serve a function. And in this case, this actually what led me to think about the brain as proactive and as being continuously on the move, to be ready, to be preparing for the future. And there are some interesting metaphors that I like to give, but they might have become cliches by now. One of them is, for example, playing. I like to play squash, and in squash you have to be always moving, even if it's if your opponent's turn, you're still moving your feet. It's much easier to move into action from a moving, and then this probably better than I do. And in one of the introductions I wrote to either the book on predictions or the special issue we had, or one of them anyway, I compared the brain to F-16, showing my past with the Air Force. And this type of fighter jets that, because they have to be so agile and so maneuverable, their steady state, in a way, is not steady at all. It's to be really wild. And it's unlike Jumbo that you want to be, the Boeing, you want to be steady and not to have any abrupt movements. Here, in order to be agile, you want to start with a system that's easily transforming to one position versus another. So, of course, it's a metaphor with a lot of caveats, so don't take it too seriously. But that's how I like to think about the default network, as preparing you, and it's much harder, it seems, to go into action or into cognition or into some kind of a mental operation from a brain dead position to rather than something that's already preparing, always thinking, always on the move. And of course, there are also, I think the default network involves a different time scales of planning and of thinking. So when you're stuck in traffic, your default network is not only thinking about the next second, because this will be boring. It will be just like this second, but it also thinks about this afternoon when you arrive home, or this evening, or your dinner, or you're going out with friends afterwards, or playing with the kids. It also involves thinking about the conference you're going to in 2 weeks, or something that's so different time scales. And there's something interesting that I want to say about this, even though I don't think I discussed it in the talk yesterday. It's the issue of simulations and the experiences in quotation marks, that they afford us. So as we all agree, I think, we store in our memory our experiences, and we store them with the primary reason. Well, there's no proof that it's the primary reason, but it seems that it's the primary reason, or at least a primary reason, of being able to use this experience in the future, right? So our behavior in the upcoming seconds or minutes or years is based on what we've learned and encoded. So in a way, experience helps us store scripts that sometimes can be action plans or motor plans, and sometimes it could be in conversation, sometimes it could be in dance, in playing basketball, or anything like this. So we use our experience, our memories, for the future. Now, the default network, this area of just sitting there and stuck in traffic, or waiting for your doctor, or being in a shower, you create new experiences, again with quotation marks. So you make simulations. You sit on a plane. I have a funny example, but what can I say? That's what went through my mind. I'm sitting on a plane and reviewing some manuscript, and I'm thinking, what would happen? It was a very long flight. What would happen if this door opens up and all of us are starting to fall? Right. So I'm thinking, I'll take this blanket that's on my lap and I'll use it as a parachute. But it might slip from my hands, if I'll be sweating or whatever. How do I make holes? I have this pen that I'm holding now. So of course, the chances of this happening is 1 in a zillion, right? But let's say less surreal simulations. We also think about other things now, right? What happens if I don't know what the electricity
gets cut
drops? Yeah. So we'll be able to manage, right? But if let's say if we both now simulate this in our mind, we think, we'll just use the iPhone for making some light, and then we go out and call somebody. Right. If it happens now, we'll be more ready than people who didn't simulate this. They'll probably also do it, but just a little later. So these simulations are an amazing way of creating experiences without experimenting. So Popper said that he lets his hypothesis die in his behalf. So you generate all these hypotheses and you choose the right one, and that's the one you store. And now when there's a situation, if it happens, then you're ready for it, even though you haven't experienced it. So I think this is very powerful. It almost allows you to just sit in your couch and experience everything in life and just store it and be ready for many things. But
would it be surprising that then this default network is, it's a relatively large number of neurons are involved in this, but still it's only a relatively small subset of your whole brain. And it's not necessarily engaging, let's say, all possible areas that might provide you with memory or with contextual information. Or, for instance, you could think about the so-called mirror mechanisms, which again would be running in different systems than this default state network. So are you then saying that the brain is running a number of substrates that support simulation, or are they sort of interlinked in some way?
That's an interesting question. So first of all, the classically defined default network does involve the medial temporal lobe. So, an area but we know that the entire brain is busy doing memory. So it's not only that. So I would suspect that if your simulation involves smell, it will recruit, at least momentarily, the olfactory cortex or auditory cortex, depending on what you're doing, on the visual cortex. What's the way the default network is defined is average across many subjects and many situations. So I would suspect that all these momentary recruitments of specific cortices or expert cortices is kind of washed out in the averaging. It's a possibility. And what you see is the major mechanism of these simulations, but you don't see these extensions that are recruited on and off.
Right. So, but then how do you see the role of, let's say, subcortical structures to this, to the default network, if it's a big simulator of the brain?
Yeah. So I think it falls under the category of what we said now about specific cortices. So if you simulate a situation that might be scary, I won't be surprised if you're recruiting your amygdala during the process. Right. But I don't think that traditionally the amygdala will be part of this default network only when the simulation or the content of your thoughts pertains to anything that the amygdala does.
Right. So that would mean what we now call the default network is really like, let's say, a very rough, backbone of the simulation structure.
Yeah.
And then let's say when you are alert and acting, it gets sort of blown up into your context network, or it sort of starts to elaborate into this context network. And then when you become inactive and relaxed again, it sort of falls back in this default state mode again. This would be roughly the model.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So for another views on the brain have focused more on, let's say, centroencephalic theories, right? Where you would say, well, cognition relies very much on, let's say, the integrative properties of basal ganglia. So in your mind, let's say it's the default network that has this sort of core integrative powers that provide us with, let's say, the contents of cognition and possibly consciousness. This is really the starting point of that, or not?
Yeah, and people have talked about the default network in the context of consciousness, but I want it to be clear that you make it almost sound like we know what's going on.
No, you're the expert. I'm posing the questions.
But gradually, we're starting both to believe that we know what we're talking about. So it has to be clear that we don't, and that the same type of simulations, I won't be surprised if different types of simulations are happening in the basal ganglia or other areas. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in order to better carve these different processes. What I said was pertaining specifically to this default network, but it doesn't exclude similar processes from taking place in other structures.
Right. And then what is the overlap really? So the default network has largely been characterized using fMRI, right? And
even though it started with PET, but that was the first demonstration.
Right.
But yeah, you're right.
But that means slow signals, right? So what do we know about, and let's say, the correlates of this default network at faster timescales?
Right. So people only now starting to look at the default network in high temporal resolution modalities such as MEG and EEG, and one of the reasons is that its majority is in the medial surface, which is hard to kind of disentangle in methods such as MEG. But now, as methods with MEG improved, we can start differentiating different medial structures. But I don't think, at least I'm not aware of the temporal characteristics of the default network, other than it's active all the time. But how does it change over time? It'll be interesting to explore. Yeah.
Okay. So, but then in the last part of your talk, you sort of moved away. But okay, there was sort of, if you want, an associative link from we go back to orbital frontal cortex. We go also back to, let's say, the role of the orbital frontal cortex in affective processing, possibly mood. And then you made the step towards depression and the study of depression. And that's how this sounded a bit surprising, because a bit like, okay, how does this now relate to this notion of context? So, so what is the relationship between, let's say, contextual processing, prediction, and now depression?
Yeah. So this link started by me reading somewhere that people in depression, and I had no interest in depression or in psychiatric disorders back in the day. To my embarrassment, but I was reading this interesting notion that people in depression have hard time incorporating context. They don't analyze the broad context, and with all our focus on context, I felt the need and obligation to try to explain what in depression is related to this context. And we started thinking more and more about symptoms, especially cognitive symptoms and symptoms that characterize the pattern of thinking of depressed people. So, for example, depressed people tend to ruminate. So they stuck in the same topic or in the same thought over and over and over. So it's a cyclical type of thinking. And this immediately sounded like the opposite of broad associative activation. So we expect, and we know that the healthy brain goes from one thought to another, and it's very associative. So unless we're busy and focused on a very narrow task momentarily, the brain really goes from one thought to another. And here we have a population that is focused on the same topic in a clinical manner. They really go on and on and on. So this already showed some kind of linking. And from there, we started looking for all this. We've accumulated all this, some of it circumstantial evidence, and some of it is fresh evidence from my lab that shows relationship between mood and associative activation, specifically as it relates to context and to predictions, associative as in context and its prediction. So when I say circumstantial evidence, is that when you have a hypothesis like this, that this population will suffer from a lack of foresight, and you open the literature and you see a couple, well, not enough, but still a couple of demonstrations that people with depression show deficiency in foresight. This supports this idea, but we also show that, first of all, we can, together with Melia Mason, a paper that came out in JP a couple of years ago, that shows that if you make even healthy individuals think narrowly versus think broadly, you can improve their mood significantly, not in a major way, but it's definitely statistically significant. So that's another way of supporting this idea. And overall, we find more and more. So, for example, we showed with MRI, we haven't published this yet, but we show with MRI that people with depression don't recruit the context network with the same efficiency. So we're thinking that, or other thing that I showed yesterday, that treatment of depression affects regions that we activate also with the contextual stimuli. So there's all this evidence that kind of converge, and we would like to bring it to fruition one day and actually help people. But for the time being, it's more an experimental, and it's something that's more in the lab, and showing that. The crux of this hypothesis is that broad association improves mood and narrow associations do not. And it also relates to inhibition, because as I showed yesterday, it's hard to show it without a slide, but that part of the reason we suspect, it's a hypothesis, it's not proven yet, but part of the reason why their brains is so ruminative and so focused and not associative is because of hyperinhibition that, according to this hypothesis, comes from prefrontal cortex structures. So this hyperinhibition makes them less associative. It doesn't let their thinking process broaden up like the healthy brain. So if we could affect levels of inhibition, or if we can train people to think more broadly, maybe we can bring about some alleviation of their symptoms in depression. But as I said before, it's very far from this, and we're still on the basic level.
But what's the causality there exactly? Because in some you're saying like, okay, we have, let's say, control from frontal areas on the parahippocampal area, which is, let's say, more an associative kind of network. And this, let's say, allows more or less, let's say, lateral thinking, if you want, or let's say more or less flexibility in an associative process. And if you restrict this too much, you get rumination, and then this leads to mood disorders like depression. This is the causality that you have in mind, right?
Yes.
But I could also argue that it might be the other way around, because you got to look, mood is related to affective processing, to neuromodulation. Neuromodulation has a quite direct impact on, let's say, lateral interactions in cortical areas. So a mood disorder leads to a deregulation of the neuromodulation that allows lateral interactions among, let's say, associative states in the parahippocampal area. Could you exclude that interpretation?
No, actually, I embrace it. I think that we talked yesterday about this chicken and egg, as you call it, the issue of it could start from the molecules and come all the way up to pattern of thinking. But what we do here and bring to the table is the optimism, so to speak, of the thought that you can actually start the other way around. You can start from the highest possible level of pattern of thinking, and maybe by training and changing the pattern of thinking to be more broadly associative, you can affect all the depressed brain all the way down to the same molecules, the same dopamine and serotonin. So it might be naive, but it's worth trying. And that's what we're doing. So just imagining that this hierarchy goes both ways.
But then this also, I guess, takes inspiration from the fact that we know that cognitive therapy works pretty well on a large group of depression patients. Is that indeed the case? The
only reservation I have is with the word large. So the problem with cognitive behavioral therapy is that it's effective, but only for a very small percentage of people. So you have to understand, and I think I told somebody like yesterday that after I wrote my first paper about depression, a colleague, good friend of mine said, I could tell you never had depression, because you have to know this population better in order to be able to explain this behavior. And you realize that people in severe depression are not really motivated to even go to a psychiatrist, let alone sit on a couch and introspect and think about their pattern of thinking, and now fighting this pattern of thinking. So anything that addresses this population or attempts to improve their situation has to be minimally demanding. Because it's a population that the nature of their symptoms is not to be involved and not to be active. So a method such as CBT, I think, is on the right track, but what it misses is this the larger part of the population of depressed that it just cannot be engaged. So the question is, can we take elements of CBT and break them down in a way that's less demanding? And I think in a way there are some overlaps between what we're saying and what CBT, and I think based on what we know about the brain, maybe we can just broaden their thinking pattern without, no questions asked. No, don't introspect and don't fight your thoughts and don't change the topics or the enemy in your thinking pattern. Just be associative. Just, play with these games that we'll be developing or something like this. And this will be more automatic and less demanding and less asking less of the patients. And maybe it will be efficient for a broader part of the population.
But do you have any evidence today that would suggest that would work?
Well, other than showing that depressed don't recruit the contextual network, well, of course, you can ask, who knows if it's trainable? Maybe this is a one-way ticket. And the other thing that we've shown is that with healthy individuals, we can improve mood by associative thinking. What is missing is to show that depressed patients are less depressed with broader associative thinking. But that's something we're working on, but it's not something that happens fast.
But now there are also correlations between, let's say, just physical exercise and the alleviation of depression, which would argue against your
No, it's
your
not. It's
proposal,
not,
no?
actually. It's
Okay.
not. Maybe that's why you and I are so happy because of running, even though you run much more. But there's actually a big wave of publications, including in popular media. The New York Times likes to write about it, about the effects of running on mood. And independently, there's this issue of neurogenesis, the growth of new neurons in dentate gyrus within the hippocampus. And of course, it's somewhat controversial, or at least still not yet to be proven completely that these new neurons actually assume a function. But assuming that neurogenesis does something, there is clear evidence that running improves or facilitates the growth of new neurons in the dentate gyrus. Interestingly, fluoxetine, SSRIs like Prozac, also increase the growth of neurons in the dentate gyrus. So we have two things that are parallel and affecting this critical structure in the hippocampus in a similar manner. So take SSRIs or take running, it almost exerts the same. Well, I can't, of course, commit to this. I didn't do the research, and I'm not sure they're comparable in terms of magnitude. But it's tempting to think of how exercise, especially aerobic exercise, weights don't exert the same effect on neurogenesis. So,
but what's interesting about it, it would be, let's say, the argument earlier was to say, look, we can take a cognitive route. We can try to change thinking patterns and from there affect mood.
Right.
While the exercise example would say it is more, let's say, from the bottom up, from the body itself and action itself, so completely non-cognitive, that you can also affect mood.
Right. So we're getting into an interesting topic that I'd like to talk about. If we have time, sure, I can expand on this. So I think that that the SSRIs like Prozac affect, if I remember the numbers correctly, about 30 to 50% of the patients. So you ask yourself, well, these are brains. Brains are brains. Why would some respond to this SSRIs and some are not? And I think it goes back to the lifestyle of depressed, as I said before. And I think this is completely speculative. So nobody writes down anything I say now. So the idea there is that all this criticism about neurogenesis, how do we know that these neurons assume a function? Well, I think that if they grow in the morning because you took drugs or you ran, SSRIs, or you ran, and you have new neurons in your dentate gyrus now, they won't connect to any network unless you engage them. Otherwise, you go to sleep, they die, and then in the morning you start this process again. So you need to engage them. So in order for improvement from SSRIs or from running, I think two things have to happen. You grow new neurons and you connect them to existing networks. And I think they are connected to existing networks by doing something else in addition to just having them grown. So learn something, play something, or etc. Do social interactions. So I think that only running won't be enough. If you just run and then you go back home and you just lie on the couch until tomorrow morning when you run again, I don't think you'll have the mood benefit. If you just take SSRIs and you sit on your couch and not do anything, maybe that's a population that is not benefiting from SSRIs. So I think you have to be both socially or intellectually engaged at the same time to give these new neurons a better chance of being engaged and being recruited to a network. And just one slightly unrelated but still important to emphasize is that I didn't talk about the fact that these dendrite gyres, I mean, it's part of the default network. The hippocampus is part of the same network that's being activated by predictions, by the default network, by contextual association. So that's pretty intriguing that this growth of new neurons and effect on mood come from a structure that both loses its volume and mass with depression, and also aging, by the way. So who knows? It might help Alzheimer's in the future, or cognitive decline with aging. But in any event, with the depression, we hope that this associative thinking, combined with maybe running, or combined with where we just said that depressed people don't do much, so make them go out run. Well, it depends. It's a spectrum, and some people will do more than others. And I think many are interested in alleviating their symptoms. Anyway,
but there would be an interesting, let's say, difference between the SSRI case and the running case, because in the running case, you would also be driving your grid cells because you're moving in space, providing an input into the dentate gyrus. So while with the SSRIs, that would not be the case. So that means in the running case, you might actually also facilitate the embedding of these neurons in active networks. Well, for purely SSRIs, that would not be the case.
Yeah, that's an interesting line of thought, and I think it has to be tested more rigorously, because, I mean, I've been thinking myself about the difference of the benefits for running, if it's running outside versus running on treadmill. I hate running on treadmill, but I was wondering, I wasn't thinking like you about the entorhinal and the grid cells, which is an interesting line of thought, and I have to consider it too. I was thinking more about the change of scenery and how it, in a way, activates more and more concepts, or maybe also associations. So it kind of, it's also intellectually pleasing in the sense that it engages more and more items in your cortex than just running in front of CNN, on the treadmill.
So if they run in front of flow fields, basically, and green fields in the television.
So you can try this in your virtual reality lab, right?
Exactly,
just
I will.
Benefit from treadmill with VR, or just running outside. Of course, outside has multiple effects. It's also fresh air and all this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But okay, that's in the future. But now, do you believe that, how do you see the basic science you're doing on this depression? Or let's say the networks that are correlated with depression, like the default network and the context network. How is that basic science translating in an impact in the clinic right now? How do you see that?
You mean beyond what we're trying to do?
Yeah. Now, well, the work you're currently doing, when do you see that really impacting the clinic? When it's going to hit the clinic in some form?
Well, I can't predict. As much as I would like predictions, I can't predict this. But we're definitely engaged in collaborations with clinicians and with psychiatric, like the DCRP at MGH with Maurizio Fava and other big and important and smart psychiatrists that are interested, which also shows you the state of the interaction between basic level neuroscience and psychiatry. I think that psychiatry could benefit from knowledge that we are acquiring in neuroscience, and the other way around, that neuroscientists can make their work more relevant and more applicable if they understand more of what's going on in the clinic. But I can't commit to how quickly. First of all, we have to show in the lab that we can improve the state of depressed individuals with our methods, and maybe improve our methods. There have been attempts to make our ideas commercialized, but I wasn't too ecstatic about it, just because I want to see more proofs. And once we have this in the lab, I think that we would like to make it widely available. Right. People can benefit from this.
Okay. So Moshe, to finish up, so you made quite a tour through the brain in some sense.
Broadly associative.
Exactly, and also revealing some really core properties of the brain. So given your experience in brain research and understanding of the mind, what would be Moshe's law?
Well, it will be make no laws ahead of time. I don't know. I mean, if I had a law in mind now, it probably would have been
This is your chance.
Well, it will be when it's proven. It will be my chance, not when I'm predicting it. But yeah, no law for you.
Really? Okay. So there's no Moshe's law.
Not now.
Okay. And then what's the key prediction that you feel most strongly about today? That so if I come to visit you there in the outskirts of Tel Aviv. No, that's where we are. 5 years from now. And say, okay, Moshe, this was your prediction you made in 2012, September. What's this one prediction that you feel most passionate about today?
That the state of psychiatric patients will be much better.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
that's
very
a prediction.
Good. Moshe Bar, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
The CSN podcast was produced by the Convergent Science Network of Biomimetics and Biohybrid Systems, a project funded by the European 7th Research Framework Programme. For more interviews, recorded lectures, or upcoming conferences in the field of biomimetics and biohybrid systems, go to csnnetwork.eu. And thank you for listening.